The lease said the landlord's name was W. Hale, and I signed it without thinking twice because why would 3 letters and a last name make me think of anyone specific? I'd moved 4 times in 6 years for work. Landlords were just names on paperwork to me by that point, numbers I wired rent to, nothing more. Then move-in day came, and the man who opened the door to hand me my keys was Wes Hale, and every single thing I remembered about being 17 years old came back at once, standing right there on a stranger's welcome mat with a box of kitchen stuff in my arms. I should explain who Wes was to me because high school crush doesn't really cover it, not fully. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business before you knew it about yourself. I figured out I was gay around 15, quietly, privately, the way you do when you're scared of what happens if the wrong person finds out first. Wes was a year ahead of me on the baseball team, the kind of popular that isn't loud about it, just easy and assumed, like the whole school had collectively decided he was one of the good ones without ever discussing it out loud. We weren't friends exactly. We had one class together senior year, an elective, ceramics of all things, because his required art credit and my required art credit happened to line up that semester. We got assigned to share a table for 4 months, and somewhere in those 4 months of glazing bowls badly and talking about nothing important, I fell for him in the specific, hopeless way you fall for someone you've already decided you can never have. I never told him. I want to be clear about that because what happened wasn't about a confession gone wrong. It was smaller and somehow worse. There was a party in April of that year at someone's house whose parents were out of town, the kind of party that existed mostly so people could say they went. I went because Wes was going to be there, which is an embarrassing sentence to say out loud even now, over a decade later. At some point that night, drunk on courage I didn't actually have, I ended up talking to him alone in the kitchen for almost 20 minutes, longer than we'd ever talked outside of ceramics, and it felt like something was happening, some kind of shift, though I couldn't have told you what exactly. Someone, I never found out who, made a comment the next week. Not cruel exactly, more like a joke that wasn't funny, something about me and Wes in the kitchen at that party, said in the hallway, loud enough for half of fourth period to hear. I remember Wee's face in that moment more clearly than almost anything else from high school. Not angry, just scared and trying very hard not to look scared, which somehow made it worse. "We were just talking," he said to the hallway, to everyone, to me standing right there. "It wasn't anything. I don't even really talk to him. 4 months of a shared ceramics table, 20 minutes in a kitchen that had felt like something to me, and that was the sentence he chose. I understand now. I understood eventually, years later, that he was 17 and terrified and reacting the only way he knew how to protect himself. At the time, standing in that hallway, all I understood was that I'd been erased in front of an audience by the one person whose opinion mattered most to me, and that hurt in a way I didn't have language for yet. We didn't speak again after that, not really. A few more weeks of the ceramics class, careful and silent, and then graduation, and then 11 years of separate lives in separate cities, until a beat-up apartment listing brought me back into a room with him without either of us seeing it coming. "Adrian," he said, standing in the doorway of the building I was about to move into, keys in his hand, and his voice did something complicated: recognition, then something like fear, then an attempt to cover both with polite landlord energy. "Wow, I didn't. The application had a different last name than I remembered. I didn't put it together until just now." "I use my middle name professionally," I said, which was true and also completely beside the point. "Small world." "Yeah," he handed me the keys like they were something fragile. "Small world. I want to tell you I handled that first meeting with grace. I did not. I took the keys, said something forgettable about the weather, and got through move-in day on autopilot, and then I sat on my new, unfamiliar couch that night and had what I can only describe as a very delayed emotional reaction to a hallway conversation from 11 years earlier. My friend Nora, who I'd known since college and who had heard the ceramic stable story exactly once years ago in a very different context, called me that night because I'd texted her something incoherent. "Wait," she said, wait, your new landlord is a baseball ceramics guy, the I don't even really talk to him guy. Apparently. Adrian, you cannot live in a building owned by the guy who publicly denied knowing you in high school. The lease is signed. That's not okay. That's not helpful information right now." "I know it's not helpful, Nora, I'm aware." I signed a legally binding document with a man I haven't thought about in years and who apparently still makes my chest do something complicated when he opens a door. That's the part I want to talk about, she said, the chest thing. There's no chest thing. You called me at 10 p.m. incoherently, there's a chest thing. I didn't have a good response to that, so I changed the subject, the way I do when Nora gets uncomfortably accurate about something. For the first month, Wheeze and I existed in the careful, formal register of landlord and tenant. He fixed a leaking faucet in my kitchen with the kind of efficient politeness you'd extend to any tenant, said let me know if there's anything else in a voice that gave away nothing, and left. I did the same in return, polite, brief, nothing beyond what the relationship required. I told myself this was fine, preferable even. Some old wounds are better left as scar tissue, not reopened just because circumstances forced proximity. It didn't stay that simple, because buildings are small and lives overlap whether you want them to or not. The specific night things shifted was during a storm in late October, one of those sudden ones that knocked the power out for hours. I was sitting in my apartment with a single flashlight and a phone at 11% battery when there was a knock at my door. Wheeze was standing there with a battery-powered lantern and an expression that looked like he'd debated knocking for longer than the walk from his apartment should have taken. "Power's out for the whole block," he said. "Could be a few hours. I have extra lanterns if you need one, and I made too much soup if you're hungry. You don't have to say yes. I just didn't want you sitting up here in the dark with nothing." I almost said no out of some stubborn instinct to keep the wall up. But it had been a long day and the apartment was cold, and some tired part of me didn't have the energy to keep performing indifference. "Yeah," I said, "okay, thank you." His apartment, one floor down, was warm with candles and the smell of something simmering, and for the first 20 minutes we sat at his kitchen table eating soup and talking about nothing. His job managing the building, mine in the city doing marketing work, I found tolerable but not exciting, small, careful things that didn't touch anything real. Then, out of nowhere, in the middle of a lull, he said, "I think about that hallway a lot." I put my spoon down. "Which hallway?" "You know which hallway." He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the candle between us, turning the little dish it sat in slowly like it needed adjusting. "I've thought about it more times than I probably should admit. I was 17 and someone made a comment that scared the hell out of me, and instead of just, I don't know, laughing it off or saying something neutral, I threw you under the bus in front of half the school to protect myself. And I never apologized, I never even acknowledged it. You just disappeared from my life a few weeks later and I let myself believe it wasn't a big deal, because believing that was easier than admitting what I actually did." I hadn't expected this conversation, not that night, maybe not ever, and I didn't know how to hold it gracefully. "It was a big deal," I said, quieter than I meant to me anyway. "I don't know if it was a big deal to you." "It was," we said. "I just didn't let myself feel that for a long time because feeling it meant admitting things about myself I wasn't ready to admit at 17. "Like what?" He was quiet for a second and I watched him decide in real time whether to actually answer that or deflect the way people usually deflect that particular question. "Like the fact that the 20 minutes in that kitchen felt like something to me too," he said. "And that the reason I panicked so badly when someone made that comment wasn't because it was untrue. It was because it was closer to true than I could survive people finding out about at the time." I sat with that for a long moment. The candle flickered. Somewhere outside, a tree branch scraped against a window in the wind. "You could have just told me that," I said, "instead of what you actually said." "I know, I was a coward. I'm not trying to excuse it, I'm just trying to finally say the actual truth instead of the version I told myself for 11 years to feel less guilty." "Why now?" "Because you moved into my building and I've spent a month pretending to be a normal, professional landlord while actually being a complete wreck every time I have to knock on your door for something mundane. And I decided I'd rather tell you the truth and have you hate me for it than keep pretending there's nothing here." The power came back on about 20 minutes later, right in the middle of a silence neither of us had rushed to fill, and the sudden light felt almost rude, like it was interrupting something that had needed the dark to happen at all. "I should go back upstairs," I said. "Yeah," we said, "probably." Neither of us moved for another few seconds. Then I did, because staying felt like admitting to something I wasn't ready to admit yet either. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my new, unfamiliar bedroom turning over 11 years of a version of the story I'd built for myself, Wheeze as the boy who erased me, Wheeze as proof that certain kinds of love always end in being denied in a hallway and trying to fit this new information into it. It didn't fit cleanly. That was the hardest part. I'd built an entire protective belief system on the version where he simply hadn't cared, and it turned out the truth was messier and somehow more painful in a different way. He had cared, and he'd been too scared to say so, and both of us had lost years to that fear. I called Nora the next morning and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which for Nora is basically a miracle. "Okay," she said once I'd finished. "I need you to actually think about this instead of just reacting to it. What do you feel, not what you think you're supposed to feel? What do you actually feel sitting here this morning?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to forgive him instantly because he said the thing I always wanted to hear back then. And part of me is furious that I had to wait 11 years and an unrelated power outage to hear it." "Both of those can be true," Nora said. "You're allowed to be moved by an apology and still be angry that it took this long. That's not a contradiction, that's just being a person." "He's also my landlord," I said. "That's the part I keep getting stuck on. If this goes wrong, I'm not just losing whatever this is, I'm dealing with an awkward power dynamic in my own home." "That's a real concern," Nora agreed. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But Adrian, you've spent 11 years building a whole identity around one hallway, around one guy's fear turning into your wound. Doesn't some part of you want to know what happens if you let yourself actually find out who he is now instead of just guarding the version of him from high school?" I didn't have a good answer for that, which usually means she's right. For the next few weeks, things between Wheeze and me existed in an uneasy, careful space, not quite back to the formal landlord distance, not quite anything else either. We started running into each other more, which I suspect wasn't entirely accidental on his part. He'd be doing something in the hallway when I got home from work, or he'd knock with some minor building update that could easily have been a text. I let it happen because some part of me wanted it to happen, even while another part of me kept a careful inventory of every reason it was a bad idea. The next real conversation happened almost a month later, on the building's rooftop, which residents technically weren't supposed to use but which Wheeze let me up to anyway one evening when I mentioned I missed being able to see stars, something my old apartment's location had allowed and this one didn't. "I need to ask you something," I said once we were both settled against the low wall, city noise humming distantly below us. "And I need you to actually answer honestly, even if the honest answer isn't flattering." "Okay. Why didn't you ever try to find me? After high school, if what you said in the storm is true, if it really was something back then, you had 11 years to reach out. Social media exists. You could have apologized any time in the last decade. Why now only because I happened to move into your building?" Wheeze was quiet for a while, and I could tell he was actually considering the question instead of reaching for something easy. "'Cause I was ashamed," he said finally. "And shame doesn't usually motivate you to reach out to the person you hurt. It motivates you to avoid them so you don't have to see your worst moment reflected back at you every time you look at their face. I told myself for years that reaching out would just be selfish, that showing up to apologize would be more about making myself feel better than actually helping you. I used that as an excuse to do nothing. It was easier than actually facing what I'd done." "That's a very convenient excuse." "I know, I'm not defending it, I'm just answering your question honestly the way you asked me to." He looked at me, and there was something raw in his expression that hadn't been there during the storm, something that looked like he was finally letting himself be fully seen instead of managing the conversation. "I didn't come find you, Adrian, you came here. And when you did, I had a choice: keep hiding behind the landlord thing, be polite and distant and let this be another 11 years of avoidance, or actually tell you the truth this time, even though the truth makes me look like exactly the coward I was at 17. "You chose the truth." "I chose the truth," he confirmed, late imperfectly, but I chose it. I looked out at the city instead of at him for a moment, because I needed somewhere else to put my eyes while I sorted through what I actually wanted to say next. "I spent a long time," I said slowly, "believing that the hallway meant something specific about me. Not just that you didn't want people to know about you. I understood eventually as an adult that fear like that isn't really about the other person. But at 17 it didn't feel like that. It felt like proof that whatever I was, whatever I wanted, wasn't something anyone would choose to stand next to in public. That took me a long time to unlearn, longer than it should have." "I'm sorry," we said, and it didn't sound performative this time. It sounded like something that had been sitting in him for 11 years finally finding its way out. I know sorry doesn't undo 11 years of you carrying that. I just don't have anything better to offer you than the truth and an apology that's embarrassingly late. It's not nothing, I said, it's just not everything either. I know. We sat there for a while after that, not talking, just existing in the same space with something heavy and complicated settled between us, and it didn't feel unbearable the way I'd expected it to. It felt like the beginning of something being carried differently, not gone, not resolved, just no longer only mine to hold alone. Things moved slowly after that, which I think was right, given everything. We started having dinner occasionally, careful and unhurried, getting to know each other as the people we'd actually become instead of the ghosts we'd been at 17. I learned that Weez had come out at 23 to his family first, a process that had been harder than he expected given how easy his life had looked from the outside. Back in high school, his father, it turned out, had said some things during that conversation that took years to fully recover from, which reframed for me uncomfortably some of why a 17-year-old version of him might have panicked so badly in a school hallway. It didn't erase what happened. It made it make a kind of sense I hadn't had access to before. I told him things too, about the years after high school where I dated carefully and briefly, never letting anyone get close enough to do again what that hallway had done, about therapy that helped me understand why I flinched at public displays of affection even with people I trusted, about how moving to this city for a fresh start had actually just been me running from a version of myself I hadn't finished healing. I don't want to rush this, I told him one evening in December, sitting in his apartment with actual light this time, no storm required. Not because I don't feel something, I do. I think I have, honestly, since the day I opened your door and 11 years came rushing back at once. But I don't want to fall into something just because it's convenient that you live one floor down and know all the history already. I need this to be a real choice, not just proximity. That's fair, we said. I don't want that either. I want you to choose this because it's actually what you want, not because I finally said sorry and you felt obligated to give the whole thing a chance. So what do we do? I don't know, he admitted, and there was something almost relieving about him not having a clean answer either. Maybe we should just keep doing this. Dinner, talking, actually getting to know each other instead of the shorthand version we've been running on, and we see what it turns into without deciding in advance what it has to be. That's mostly what happened over the following months, slow, deliberate, unglamorous. We didn't have some big cinematic moment where everything was resolved at once. What we had instead was a gradual unlearning, both of us relearning how to trust something we'd each, in our own ways, decided years ago wasn't safe to want. The night we actually kissed wasn't dramatic either, which felt right, given everything that came before it. We were in his kitchen, the same kitchen from the storm, though the lights were on this time, ordinary and unremarkable, doing dishes after dinner, arguing lightly about whose turn it was to dry. And in the middle of that argument he just looked at me, the way you look at someone when 11 years of almost has finally worn down into something simpler, and I looked back the same way. And neither of us said anything, we just stopped arguing and let the space between us close on its own. It wasn't perfect. My hands were still wet from the dishes and it made things a little clumsy, and we both laughed about it right in the middle, which somehow made it better instead of worse, less like the movie version, more like something two actual people were building together instead of performing. I've wanted to do that since the storm, Weez admitted afterward, forehead resting against mine. Maybe longer if I'm honest. Maybe since a ceramics table 11 years ago that I never let myself think about properly until you showed back up. I know the feeling, I said. I still live in that building. Weez is still my landlord, technically, which makes for some genuinely ridiculous conversations about rent increases that neither of us quite knows how to navigate gracefully yet, laughing through the awkwardness because the alternative is pretending it isn't strange, and pretending has never really worked for either of us. I think about that hallway sometimes still. I don't think that feeling ever fully disappears. The memory of being denied by someone whose opinion mattered too much at an age when you don't yet know how to protect yourself from that kind of wound. But I've started to understand it differently now, not as proof of something wrong with me, but as two scared teenagers who didn't have the tools yet to be honest, given a second, unlikely chance 11 years later to finally say the things that fear didn't let them say the first time. I didn't go looking for him, he didn't go looking for me. A lease, signed without either of us realizing what we were signing up for, put us back in the same building, and somehow that was enough, not fate, not anything that tidy, just two people finally old enough and tired enough of hiding to tell each other the truth when the opportunity showed up uninvited at the door. Some nights I still think about how easily I could have signed that lease, met him for 2 minutes on move-in day, and let the whole thing stay exactly as formal and distant as it started. I think about how close we both came to just letting 11-year-old fear keep winning, quietly forever, under the cover of politeness. I'm glad the power went out that night. I'm glad he knocked instead of leaving me in the dark.